Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's webinar. Hopefully people get in here. I know that was a tad confusing. As you're joining, hopefully you can hear me and see the Power of Performance WKO5 screen. I'll stall a little more. The Zoom webinar system just takes a while to join people. It's kind of funny. For as popular it's going to take a good 2 to 3 minutes for everybody to get into the webinar. Do think there was some join confusion, so I have a feeling we're going to see some late joiners in here. Um, yep, still see people joining. Either way, I don't have a really good stalling prepared, so I'm going to go ahead and just get started. So welcome to tonight's webinar. My name is Tim Cusick. I'm the Training Peaks WKO product leader. And I'm here to give you the little overview of the power of performance tonight. One of the things that Kevin and Williams and I have wanted to do for a while was just engage or have the ability to talk about the concept of power training and some of the evolution that has gone on with it as we really now have power data, a power duration model, and resulting physiological metrics. I want to make sure everybody is quite aware that tonight's presentation is my opinion. Um, there are, a lot of smart people out there who might or might not agree with my opinion. That's totally cool with me. But I am going to just give you my best thoughts and how I see things. What I really recommend for you is that you formulate your own opinion, utilize some of this learning to really go beyond and figure out your own concepts and thoughts. All right, that's about as much stalling as I can do. Let's roll. During tonight's webinar, I do want you to ask questions as you go. We do use the Zoom system here now. So on the bottom of your screen, probably in slightly different formats, you have a Q&A box. If you click it, you're able to submit a question. I'm watching the questions on the right-hand side of the screen. Feel free to drop them in as we go, and I'll try to answer them as we go, unless it's too distracting. Please do not use the chat box. There's this weird thing with the chat box with Zoom. It's hard to follow both questions and chat. So just go focus on the Q&A box. Okay. Let's talk about power training as a whole. If you remember, I don't know, about 2 months ago, what really kicked this off was Kevin had posted a question in the Facebook group about, what is the objective of endurance sports? And he compared it to like golf, right? It's you have a club and some balls and you try to sink the ball in X amount of holes in the least amount of strokes, right? And he asked people to think about that for cycling and cycling events and all endurance sports, really. And we got an array of answers, and it was like, well, that really led us to begin to talk about the concepts of power training. And Kevin kind of created this, what he ended up calling the Williams Manifesto, because we were batting it back and forth in Skype, one of the ways we talk, and it was kind of an excellent summary. The goal of endurance sports is, as a single event or aggregate of events, for an athlete to exert him or herself, which we're going to call force, to complete some course defined by some start and end point in time or distance, we call that displacement, in a duration shorter than the other competitors' time. Well, the funny thing is, right, and this is something that's very lost, power is really just force times displacement divided by time. We're going to work back into that. We're going to get into a little deeper in the power aspect. This interestingly aligns exactly with the goal of endurance sports as stated above, right? So we have a goal of performance in endurance sport, and we actually have this uniquely specific measurement methodology, system, process, science, call it what you want, that it directly aligns with success within the chosen sport. So the reality is, if you think about that, how an athlete can minimize time over the course, that's really what we're looking for, right? There's tactics, skill, how to use drafting, attacks, course features, things like that. But in the end of the day, it really comes down to fitness and how we apply more power in the direction of the finish line. I'm going to focus on that today, right? So let's start with that idea, the finish line. So here you have it, winner, winner, chicken dinner, right? So let's talk a little bit about how the race was done. If we were to remove those things we just talked about, race skills, mental toughness, tactic, luck, mechanical efficiencies, other racers' mistakes, right? Really, what we have left is this idea of natural ability and developed fitness, right? At the end of the day, that's the core of what we're talking about. And that's the alignment between power as a metric, whether you call it a training metric or a performance metric or anything like that. That simply is that reality. Now, did she win because she had the highest FTP or the highest VLA max? Or did she win because she just put out the highest power? The reality is none of those are true, right? Probably none of those are true. Maybe they might be true, but they weren't the indicator. They weren't the predictive reason. They weren't the exact cause of her victory. She won simply because she had the best performance. So the big question, how was she able to have that performance? Well, when we built WKO and we were working with Dr. Andy Cogg and really trying to figure out models and metrics and things like that and how deep we should go, we knew a truth or two about performance training and how power fit into there. And we set out to expand upon that to evolve it some. But what's happened maybe over time is that evolution has been kind of some shiny, bright new toys, but it might have gotten people off the core of what makes power training such a powerful system. No pun intended. So let's talk about performance training. So if you talk about performance training, I use this quote all the time. Elite athletic performance involves the integration of muscular, cardiovascular, and neurological factors that function cooperatively to efficiently transfer the energy from aerobic and anaerobic ATP turnover into velocity and power, right? And these two are clearly related. We need to move our bike or we need to run. We need to get faster from point A to point B if we want success in our desired activity. And all we need is a little training, right? So here's training. These are the physiological determinants of performance. You got some muscle fiber type, some blood volume. You've got some neuromuscular power. You got some sustainable power. Oh yeah, don't forget about via. Well, the reality is when you start talking about power, when you start talking about training, and you look at all the aspects, these physiological determinants, it's complicated. And whenever you understand a complicated system, you have to understand that they're subject to, and I stole this from, I was watching a webinar a couple of months ago from Dr. Steven Seiler, and he said this, and it was like, wow, man, that's like the right way to articulate it. Something I've always known and preached, but never had the right word. So I stole it. So I'm blatantly confessing. He called it the butterfly effect. And most of us know from movies or or some other formats like what the butterfly effect is. And that's the idea that small changes in training stimuli, or not just training stimuli, but also environment, situation, stress. I mean, there's all kinds, but small changes can have significant downstream effects on this very complicated process of controlling all of these physiological determinants into something we call training. So let's understand that a little deeper before we start talking about power and physiological metrics. What is training? So when you go back to this training, it goes way back, early 1900s. There's this idea of general adaptive syndrome. And I've shown this before. I'm going to keep this pretty simple. But the reality is we introduce some new stimuli. The system goes into alarm. Performance goes down during that alarm reaction to the new stimuli. The system begins to get used to that new stimuli, goes into what's known as the stage of resistance. Performance is improving because we are recovering, right? We are adapting to that new stimuli. At some given point, though, that new stimuli only gathers so much recovery and growth, plateau comes, and eventually, if we keep exposing to that stimuli, we fall down off the other side. This is a performance concept. It wasn't actually written initially about, it wasn't developed initially about exercise. It was really just overall reaction to stress. And that applies very well to exercise because exercise is a stress. And the system goes under this very much so. Alarm, resistance, and exhaustion are the phases. But here's where we start to run into some problems, right? We've wanted to quantify this system of training for a very long time because we believe that which we quantify, we can control. And then the reality is that's just not true. We can quantify it to some degree. The control part is the struggle, right? And here's why, and I'll try to give a pretty good overview of this. We talk about training load all the time, right? But load is neutral, but important. So when we talk about chronic training load or CTL, or online on Training Peaks, what they call fitness, right? Load is neutral. We don't know, it doesn't have specificity, right? It doesn't have uniqueness. It doesn't have concept. It really is just a measurement of load we are putting on the system. It's neutral, but yet it is very important. We know load is important. Stress is linear. We can measure stress pretty well, take a score like a training stress score, or even take a score like CTL, right? Since it's based on training stress score. You want to, we can take stress at 100, right? And if we want to double stress, we can make 100 to 200, whether you want to call that training stress score or some type of ramp rate of CTL. The relationship of applying stress is linear. But then we have this idea of strain, right? Strain is a problem child because it's nonlinear. And as a matter of fact, adaptation is really the troublemaker because even though it follows the stress strain paradigm, it kind of plays by some of its own rules. So here's kind of a wordy slide. One of the things I said to Kevin preparing for this webinar was, Dr. Andy Coggan, who has been doing this for a long time. I know you don't see him much on the internet anymore. He's kind of moved on to he runs a big lab now. And the reality is, though, he was pretty good at this stuff. He had some really good ideas. This came from a really old webinar of his, being ahead of the time. I thought it was pretty cool because it still holds true today. So we look at the physiological strain versus performance, right? We look at physiological reaction or events. Stress is linear. I just gave you the example, 100 to 200 stress points. I want double the stress, double the points, double the work, double the load. But when we start thinking about physiological strain, that increases in a non-linear function, but it is a function of training load, meaning training load can be linear, but that physiological strain, what your body's going under, is not linear. And physiological adaptations only occur if you exceed some minimum threshold in terms of training load. So wait a minute. I need training load, which is neutral. I can measure that sort of with stress, which is linear. So I need a certain amount of that linear stress and load, but also the strain response is nonlinear, and so is adaptation, but I still need to get over it. So pretty confusing, huh? And then when we look even deeper at physiological adaptations, they actually increase rapidly once this threshold is exceeded, the threshold of load, right? But then they slow down and eventually saturate or plateau. So if you're in a lab measuring every day or using power duration metrics, which is where you can assume I'm going, there's a point where those metrics will saturate. They'll simply plateau. And nothing will happen. Those metrics, if you just kept training, they just stay flat. Keep that in mind. Now let's just talk about performance. Performance tends to follow the same rules. Performance improves only if you exceed a certain minimum threshold in terms of training load. If you go out and ride your bike for 15 minutes, 3 days a week, you will not get faster. You're not going to add enough load to the system to ever have any type of a response. Performance increases rapidly once this threshold is exceeded, but peaks and then declines after some optimal level is achieved. This is overreaching. So when we talk about plateau and overreaching and all these terms, here's where you really have to begin to think about the separation of physiological metrics and utilization of physiological understanding and actual performance data, power outputs, performance in a race, those that connect tighter. And one of the things, and I'm going to go a little deeper on this, but just remember as part of performance, power is the best predictor of performance itself. We're going to get deeper into this. So to visualize this, let's look at it this way. Stress is linear. Strain is nonlinear. It doesn't follow what your, and stress is internal or external, strain is internal, and adaptation is even more mixed up. But let's look at it maybe in a way you're more familiar to think about it in a training in a dose response mechanism, right? And this is the idea of stress, strain, and adaptation. Stress is an external event. Strain, so you go out and you pedal your bike, right? And you do watts. You're doing 300 watts. That's an external measurement. That's stress you're putting on the system. You're putting 300 watts of stress on the system. You finish a hard ride and you have 200 training stress points. That's a measurement of the external measurement, the stress you have placed on the system. Your body undergoes strain. So, in the name of that stress, what's going on internally? Then, with a little bit of rest and the proper rhythm, you hope the body adapts. But let's look at that a little deeper. You start at some level of homeostasis, right? Your body is a machine and it always wants to, when that homeostasis is interrupted, it wants to return to homeostasis. So adaptation really is a process of that desire. So when we start thinking about stress, we add training load. Remember, load is just neutral, like stress, it's neutral. And in our training load, the only thing we really can control that begins to be predictive is our training intensity distribution. These two are very related. Am I going to do 20 hours a week at 50% of threshold or 60% of threshold, just ride around really slow? Am I going to be doing sweet spot intervals at 90% of threshold? Am I going to be doing VO2 max intervals at 110% of threshold? Stress application we can control through the idea of total load, which is neutral, and we can make it a little less neutral. We can get to this point of predicting or beginning to cross over into the strain world by training intensity distribution. But once we go under strain, we have two other things to think about. One, there's a neuromuscular manipulation going on that isn't always um, predicted within the training load or training intensity distribution. Neuromuscular manipulation is how motor unit recruitment, contractile force, muscular strength, right, is brought into this metabolic equation. There's a big difference between grinding out at 55 RPM up a hill and spinning up a hill at 95 RPM. There's a dramatic difference of constantly riding short rolling terrain and punchy crits versus riding steady state time trials, right? So there's a neuromuscular manipulation adding into the mix and the strain. And then you also have to have this understanding that the response, the strain you're going on, it's nonlinear to the stress, meaning it doesn't exactly match the stress. So if you go out and did a workout that you normally get 100 TSS on, and it just didn't feel that hard because you were well rested, well fed, and ready to ride. And then you do that, a week later and you haven't rested, you've had a stressful couple of days, your nutrition's all messed, and you go out and you try to do that, like, wow, that was really hard, way harder than it was a week ago. The strain was higher because the system wasn't as prepared. So you have nonlinear events with variables going on. You're trying to take those two relationships and make a determination if they're plus or negative in their influence. Because the strain reaction is going to send the adaptive signal that your body is going to respond to, adapt to, and actually use that same signal to supply system specific strain. And if you rest a little, right, you want the system to return to a new homeostasis, a little better, a little stronger, right, or a little more prepared for the type of stress before when it was up here and after you applied all this. That's training. And that's adaptation to training. And that's this ability to try to take a linear event, apply it to a non-linear system, and project out and predict a non-linear response. That's really hard, right? And probably you're like, great, Tim, thanks for laying out the problem. Yep, you're welcome. That's the problem right there. And this is where it makes it really hard. I'm going to try to give a couple of examples. I'm actually going to give a fair amount of examples of what this means and how we can control this a little bit better. But I'm not going to get too deep. I'm not trying to teach you how to coach. I'm giving you some concept ideas that hopefully will lead you down a path to think about the data and metrics you're using in your coaching. Because in the end of the day, if you want to go back to this idea of adaptation, how did I get to be a winner, right? You have to measure all this change somehow. This neutral training load, this linear training stress, this nonlinear strain, this nonlinear physiological adaptation, and actually a nonlinear change in performance, because adaptation is not always a good thing, right? Um, Here's a workout for you. I want you to do it every day for the next 6 months. I want you to lay on your couch for 8 hours. And I guarantee your body will adapt to that stimuli. It won't be good. It probably won't have a positive change in performance, but it will change you, and it will in a non-linear fashion. Some people will get way more unfit. Some people won't get quite as unfit. It won't be the same for everybody. When you're looking at all these metrics, right, here's a words of wisdom. Power is the best predictor of performance. Starting to see a trend? Now, we take this idea of stress, strain, and adaptation, really the best result. And I think what WKO and the power duration curve and bringing this combination of power data, which is the best predictor of performance, and along with the ability to get pretty high quality physiological metrics, the ability to control all this comes in our ability to match performance data, power, and the resulting physiological metrics. So let's dig into that a little bit. What is power training? What is metrics? What are we specifically talking about? All right, simple enough. Just a couple of examples. You want to say, wow, what were we measuring, right, in power data? Well, we had the classic numbers of 5 second, 1 minute, 5 minute, 20 minutes, 60 minutes, numbers like that. Right. And we could profile these numbers, we can track progress in these numbers, we can measure these numbers. And to be honest, for all the simplicity you get out of that, people want to move away from that really great simple answer. But the reality is having specific time measurements is a powerful solution. We also have metrics. The power duration curve is a physiological metric in its own part and is often underutilized for what it is. But then we also have Pmax and VLA max and FRC and VO2 max and FTP and TTE and stamina, right? And the reality, as I said, we need both of these working together, but don't forget power is the best predictor of performance. So what is power data? All right, I want everybody to put on their thinking cap right now. We're going to get kind of pretty conceptual. Here's a challenge for you. Do this. You'll have a really cool experiment if you do what I'm about to say. You'll learn a lot as a coach. After this session's over, Google search, what does a power meter on a bike measure? What does power in running measure? What is power data? And you're going to find an amazingly small amount of information out there. See, what's happened over the years, because power so perfectly aligns with the endurance sport. Go back to slide one, the manifesto, the Williams manifesto, right? it so perfectly aligns with this sport that we've almost stopped thinking about what power is, and we've just made it a number, like a black box. And we don't go back to what power, what it really represents, what it's telling us, which in some people, in my opinion, at times is hurting us in using the data correctly. So let's talk about power. So when we start talking about power, we start talking about what is work. So force times distance equals work, right? But then if you take force times distance or force and you times that by distance divided by time, that's how we get power, right? That is power. That's not how we get power, but that is power. So we're talking about force times distance divided about time by time. But most people don't think out the next red step. And this has gotten so lost. If you wanted to name distance divided by time, that's what speed is, right? If I can get from where I'm standing today to 20 miles away in an hour, right? Distance divided by time basically will tell me I went 20 miles an hour. It's speed. So really, when you start thinking about force, that's when we start thinking about power, it's force times speed. Now go back to slide one. I almost wish I'd kind of superimposed that here in this idea of getting from a point to a point, right? Because distance over time could also be, or distance can be displacement. Back to this idea that power is the driver. So let's go just a touch deeper on this understanding of what you're really measuring in force times speed. Work is a positive when it has a component in the direction of this displacement. I need it to carry me from start point to finish point, right? And think about it, you're on a bike and I'm somehow creating force in a circular motion and speed is occurring. The bike or velocity might, the bike is moving down the road. It's going forward. It's going from point A to B. But work is negative when it has a component in the opposite direction of displacement. And we can actually measure that in a lot of ways. And you would see that formula and be like, well, Tim, what does that mean? So let's just talk about a pedal stroke, right? It's easiest to understand this idea of power. So you're pedal stroking and you're fixed in a crank and they're at 1 foot's high, 1 foot's low, and then you're circling around each foot at opposites, correct? When you're pushing down, one pedal stroke is creating positive force. It's the driving component. It's translating into velocity, right? It's translating into speed. That positive force is moving the bike forward. But the reality is the back foot coming up is creating force itself, isn't it? It doesn't just disappear. And even if you're lifting, there's some impact on that force factor, right? The question is that force is actually typically working against, and it should be, by the way, working against moving the bike down the road. And then the idea there is all that, we're trying to maximize the amount of power, positive and negative, that's translating into velocity. That's why you see a lot of talks about optimal cadence, pedal stroke quality, balance, all this stuff, because in the world of power, it's meaningful. It's also meaningful just as a sidebar in the formula you're looking at. Think about if you have left, right, if you have crank, right? If you have a crank-based power meter, it's not measuring the plus minus of that. It's taking the overall or the aggregate number and apply and all of the total force is moving the bike down the road. The hard part about doing pedals with vector measurement capability left and right is you have to measure forward force that applies to the bike and subtract force that doesn't. So there's a lot more math going on in making pedals work. Now, I know that's a long talk about power and a deeper dive. Most people now are beginning to shut off in that sense. But remember, when we start thinking about the utilization of power in our training, we have to also know that the power is a positive and it works towards uh, displacement, positive displacement. It gets us from point A to point B, hopefully, in lower and lower times. Now, when we particularly talk about that as application to pedaling stroke, most of this is very well known. Force makes an object move. Torque makes an object turn. So when you're pedaling, you're applying torque, not force, right? It translates to force through gears and chains and tires and things like that. Um, Velocity is the speed at which an object moves. So force plus torque plus velocity, pedaling power. Or simply, you can improve force and torque. You can apply more force to the pedal, moving it forward, and torque going around in the circle. Or you can improve cadence or angular velocity or push harder, pedal faster, right? That's the simple truth to making more power. So more power reduces time. Again, a no-brainer, right? Everybody's gonna be like, Tim, that's a blinding flash of the obvious. But understand where what's happening with all of this data and all this metrics. We're talking so much about some of the other factors, heart rate, HRV models, this, that, the other thing. We're losing track of this reality. Power is the best predictor of performance. So we also talk about power as a measurement of overcoming resistance, and that's totally true. We get mechanical friction, bearings, wheels, things like that. We get aerodynamic drag, sitting up in your drops, all the different things. But in the end, to go faster, the amount of power needed. This is again important math, but only if you're really thinking deeply about it. Power needed to increase, so to go faster, the amount of power needed increases with square of speed. It's not linear, right? Because air resistance is not linear. But time decreases linear with speed. Take a screenshot of that, and your job tonight over your little tea before you go to bed is to really think about that reality of how and what we need to do to improve power, to improve velocity and speed. More work is done to arrive sooner often than we think. So what power data do I use and how do I use it, right? Well, let's just start with a couple of ideas in training. Let's talk about diagnosis of needs. So a lot of times if you're a coach in this group, you get a new athlete comes into the mix, you're like, wow, I need to figure out this athlete. And in the old days, we used to have this kind of power profile, right? And this is your 5 minute, probably could have not stacked them like that. But this is your 5 second, 1 minute, 5 minute, and 20 minute, or this one's actually your threshold, right? So we're looking at this as numbers, and these are probably 1 week or 4 week blocks. And we'd be like, oh, wow, look at the shape of this. This person's got a strong VO2 max and not so strong because this is comparing it to others, right? And we knew how to read the shape of that, and we do our power profiling. Well, that's still very true today. And it's funny how this gets lost. There's a power profile, the chart names are here. There's a power profile in the power duration curve that does the same thing this does, but instead of just doing it for somewhere between 4 and 6 time ranges, it does it for all time ranges. So this power duration curve with profile is power duration curve is based off your mean max curve. You can see that also in the yellow. And you can compare the red, which is your power duration curve, or the yellow, which is your actual mean max power at every given second. It's giving you this for every second of the game. So I always start with that. When I get a new athlete, the first thing I want to do is just visually look at their power profile. I want to understand. What's the second thing we do with power? Why do we really want power training? Well, the reality is we want to set power driven training zones. Power is a powerful tool, no pun again, for prescription. Now it's funny when Dr. Coggin was early in the power training phases, and him and other leaders like Alan Lim and Dean Gulich and Kevin and the gang, they were figuring this out. Andy would say it's descriptive, not prescriptive or prescriptive. But the reality is it's always been prescriptive. And when Andy and I did a lot of work on eye levels and stuff like that, he kept saying it's descriptive. And I said, but everybody's using it for prescription. We need a better prescription. And the reality is we want to set these power driven zones because power training zone systems based on, we want to base them on estimating certain physiological markers. And we started that with threshold, right? You go back to the original idea of threshold. What really happened in there was when the team was working on using power data, they figured out that we can use power data in the field and make or develop a functional way to measure threshold. And let's in this case call it lactate threshold 2. To keep it real simple, we'll call it LT2, right? And they said, wow, we can estimate that in the field. That means athletes don't need to go to a lab once a month or once every other month to try to go through all these exhaustive testing to get LT2. And that was the original model, right? That was the original metric, the original power driven data point. And that idea of LT2 being FTP, or an excellent estimate of FTP, really launched all these ideas of we can use that as an anchor, since we now knew LT2, because all training zone systems are basically have a relationship, not anchored, might be a little strong, but generally anchored to LT1 or LT2. Your LT1 is the onset of blood lactate. That's where blood lactate begins to accumulate in the body. Very simplified version of that. And LT2 is when that accumulation gets too rapid for us to manage. So keep that simple. But the reality is when we set those zones on FTP, as the intensity of training and prescription, the dose, the old system was just that, right? It functionalized the determination of LT. I should put 2 in there. This is going to end up on the internet and everybody's going to tell me there's more than one threshold at LT2 via power data. So we knew how to estimate it. We also knew that FTP and LT is the best indicator of metabolic capability and fitness. So it's one of the best single markers for cycling. I'm going to explain something here because it's probably going to help for where I'm going to go. So you know how you have like, gee, what are the key determinants of endurance sport performance? You have 2 key determinants, keys. Now everything's important. You need to look at the 360 athlete. You need to look at the whole deal of Pmax and effort and all those things. But what are the key indicators? The key things we want to look at are VO2 max and LT2. FTP, right? Here's why. VO2 max sets the upper limit, and it is most indicative of your cardiovascular fitness. But we love to intermingle cardiovascular fitness with the theory of metabolic fitness. They're related, but they're 2 different things. Your LT2, your LT2 is the best metabolic or the best measurement of your metabolic fitness. So if you were to track 2 pieces of data, and you guys have seen me preach this in other webinars, you want to track your VO2 max because it is the best indicator of your cardiovascular fitness. Typically, the biggest limiter we have to cardiovascular fitness is pump, stroke, and volume, VO2 max, right? So the ability to raise that VO2 max will have significant impacts on your cardiovascular fitness. The ability to, your threshold is an excellent measuring of your metabolic fitness because you literally are working harder, producing less lactate. So those 2 are key. But the challenge in the old system, this was, just having the concept based on FTP, which was LT2, it talked about metabolic fitness only. And Andy is quick to tell you that the system of TSS and FTP is a metabolic system because it's based on metabolic measurement. But the reality is when you think about LT2 and FTP, call it what you want, you're just taking a convenient way of describing with a signal number the non-linear relationship between lactate concentration and exercise intensity. And I will tell you, it doesn't come down to a singular number. It's fuzzy in that area, and it's not exactly the same day to day. And that over precision use has hurt coaching more than it's helped it. But I'm going to get a little deeper into that. But the reality is, at that given point, it was the best anchor for training zones. Now, in the new world, where we've been able to take more data, we have functionalized the determination. We've functionalized determination of the performing athlete's full power duration relationship. That's what this curve is doing. It is not a predictor of performance. It's simply functionalizing the whole power duration relationship so we can completely understand the underlying engine, the physiological capabilities, cardiovascular, metabolic, neuromuscular, working together. Remember my slide about what training is, making those things work together cooperatively. Now we can specifically recognize the deeper relationship between metabolic and cardiovascular fitness. And we need to leverage that. The weakness of the old system was not fully individualized and more metabolic markers needed more. That's a good typo. We needed more metabolic markers. That's what that's meant to say. Here, really all we have, the only limiter we have in the model itself is we need to feed it every 4 to 6 weeks and not overfeed it, which is a bad habit, but we need to feed it. I'm going to go back and answer one question on profiles on age. Gary asked if we have enough data to do age and gender. Gary, we've always done gender. You only see the male one if you're a male. If you switch it to female, you'll see the female one. It's just an auto. But age we don't have because the reality is there's too many variables as we age. Some of us perform just as well. Some people drop off. They just don't have the variables to quantify it by age. But I'm trying to keep up with the questions as I go. It just makes it easier. All right. So once we get this understanding that we now can understand the relationship of the entire operating system, we can better quantify that cooperative effort of cardiovascular, metabolic, neuromuscular, and neurological response in that power duration curve. We can create a superior system of training zones and optimized intervals. But I will tell you right now one thing, and this is going to sound kind of like bullshit, whatever. I get it. And maybe I'm selling something to somebody. If you're not using training eye levels, if you're not using the eye levels, maybe not optimized intervals, because they might be something that's not fully right for you, or the timing might not be right. But if you're not using eye levels every day, you simply are not taking hold of a little bit of low hanging fruit that can significantly improve your training. The better we can apply the stress, the better we can predict the strain, and better meaning more individualized, more specific to your unique physiology, the better we can predict this nonlinear event of strain, and the better we can predict the nonlinear adaptation. So eye levels are not anchored to a single FTP point, as probably most people know. We've been preaching this for, I don't know, Kev, how many years have we been doing this? 6 or 7, right? It's something different. The reality is it's more spread out than that. Optimized intervals are even deeper, just points of key inflections. Now, I'm trying to stay conceptual here, so I'm not going to go too deep, but there are, watch the interval, individualizing your training. I go deep about these points. Other things we can want to measure stress with power data. We have training stress score, chronic training load, acute training load, training stress balance, right? TSS is a stress measurement. Power gives us an excellent, perfectly quantified system of applying a measurement of how much stress we're applying to the system. And it's funny, I was watching a pretty well-known exercise physiologist talk about training stress. He was doing a webinar sort of attempting to pick training stress apart. And that's cool. You know, we've been doing it from the beginning. We're the developers of training stress. WKO was the product that, and Cycling Peaks really was the product that developed it. Coggin developed it. Kevin developed it. It's been around for a while. And you see that at times, right? People who pick apart training stress. And they'll say, you know, content and it needs a little more, you know, it's neutral. You'll hear things like that, right? The reality is the first question that PhD professor got, well, if training stress has those limiters, what system do you use and what are you doing better? And they said, oh, well, I use training stress because I can't come up with a better one yet. And I've heard that answer a lot. It gives you a pretty good metric. It was a pretty smart development. Don't get me wrong, it has some weaknesses and other stuff, but it is a perfect quantification of external training stress. So all good things. Pretty basic so far, huh? What else can I measure? How about actual power? What's so funny is we have lost sight of just focusing on average power and trend and impact of what you actually can do. Power is the greatest predictor of performance success, and it should be at the core of everything we're measuring. So you could take, I just pulled the chart example called peaks, 5 second, 1 minute, 5 minute, 20 minute. You can see there's trend lines and all these great things. Like this is some really good coaching. This is when your peaks chart looks like this, you give your coach a raise. I don't know who this is, but I will tell them that because it came from my set somewhere. Um, I also want to tell you one thing here in power measurement. You should measure power on a more consistent basis above 20 minutes. We tend to cap out all of our measurement thinking above or measurement thinking below 20 minutes. That's not enough. And the same in the reality of 20-minute testing and all those deals. The reality is there's still a lot of external uh, change going on between 20 and 30 and 40 minutes. By 40 minutes of hard effort, most of the metabolic transitions you're going through have really settled down and is more predictive. So measuring times from 40 minutes up is important too. You can measure outputs over time. And this is just a chart called work and power review. This is actually a pretty powerful chart. I use it a fair amount because it tells you change. It's slope measurement of change and intensity in training. Pretty good way of looking at it. And all you're doing is taking this kind of snapshot and looking at a bigger picture with more factors going on. Another thing we can measure with power, we can estimate the anaerobic and aerobic system impact simply with new training impact score. Um, we have the ability to rank it on a score of 1 to 10 and kind of break it into three key areas. It's an excellent ballpark measurement. I know that's almost like an oxymoron, right? But it gives you some insight into impact. All right, so let's press on. What's a physiological metric? We've gone over some core power items. What's a physiological metric? Well, what is a metric? It's a power duration model driven estimation oh, estimation of key physiological markers in endurance training and performance. So really we're looking at the yellow, right, is the power duration, or sorry, the yellow is your mean maximal power curve, your power duration actual output. And the red is your power duration curve. You can see this athlete matches up pretty darn well. You can just visually see it. This power duration curve itself, we needed to smooth. We need a more an improved mean max power curve to be able to do the understanding of physiological metrics. But the funny thing is once we develop the ability to physiological metrics, we have to talk about this evolution. So power training came out, right? And power training had a bunch of numbers and numbers were bouncing around the screen. And guys like Kevin said, wow, we need to be able to do something with this. And Andy had this idea that if we could just get a threshold, instead of having to go to the lab and have your lactate measured and 4 millimole number this and 2 millimole number that, everything else, right? He said, let's just use it on functional power. Let's just find a way to measure it in the field and take these lab metrics out to field data. And they developed FTP. FTP has been pretty strong utilization. I know there's question marks at times and whatever, but it's hard to escape it because it just works, right? It's worked. It's been a successful tool for a while. So then we're like, cool, let's improve it and start to take field data lab metrics, FTP plus, let's call it. And I didn't want to ignore critical power. There is another system out there that of critical power. I think FTP is better than a critical power. Depends on which critical power you use. The fact that there's multiple models should tip your hat, but I didn't want to ignore it, right? And this idea was like, wow, can we take power data and create field data lab metrics and field data modeling, which we did, right? Hence the power duration comes, and suddenly we have the ability to take your performing power data, which is the greatest predictor of performance itself, and give you some insight into the underlying physiological metrics. But what's everybody kind of drifting back to? All we want to do is translate the power into the lab metric and talk about the metric. Do not lose sight of the power data itself. It's so important to keep in your coaching. Why? Power is the best predictor of performance. Seeing a trend build, right? All right, so what metrics are important? I'm going to come right back to this. One of my keys, and again, remember, this is my opinion. You're kind of stuck with my opinion. Go back to this idea of diagnosis. When I look at an athlete, I look at their power profile, look at their power trends, the actual little peaks chart we were looking at. I always look at that, just understanding where they're kind of heading right now. So I understand the athlete I'm looking at today, and then we'll look back in their history. Then the second place I go is I'm looking at this chart, compare VO2 max to MFTP as a percentage of cycling. I think we've made people more and more aware of this. But if you listen to my explanation earlier about VO2 max, greatest indicator of cardiovascular fitness, FTP, greatest indicator of metabolic fitness, you also know from my other webinars probably that there's a relationship between the two. Since you need the cardiovascular system, working to as part in hand, obviously with your metabolic performance, VO2 max is the ultimate cap, your threshold. Eventually, you're only going to get so close. And that's usually about a well-trained athlete, let's call it 85%. The reality is I'm always looking at that relationship. So here's VO2 max. The scales are a little different. Here's VO2 max relative. Here's MFTP, and here's the percentage of one to the other. So what I'm looking at time is what was the cardiovascular fitness and capability? What was the metabolic capability? And here's what I'm looking for. Here's the secret, right? At any given time, did the athlete put those two together at max? Highest VO2 max, highest highest MFTP. That's probably the point that athlete, not probably, I will guarantee it, if you put those two together, the athlete, I shouldn't say that because they could have a muscular problem or some other deficiency, but from from a general training sense, you have a super high chance of an absolute peak performance when you can make those two dance together. That's really important. And I just blew that up so you can see the numbers. That's just a blow up of that so you can see it. Remember, FTP, best indicator of metabolic performance, VO2 max, best of cardiovascular fitness, and here's the relationship cap. Excellent thing you should be measuring in performance. Don't forget why I just explained the VO2 max. Back to that slide. Over it. Second thing I do is I also, when I'm in diagnostic phase, I want a physiological profile. So this is gender specific, but not age, Gary. We just don't have the detailed data on age because the variables, it's too wide. But it is gender specific, and this is female. I can tell by the color. And we can measure where their Pmax FRC is against a database of norms. This athlete is a very good pursuiter woman, has a world-class kind of 1-2 minute power number. So you could see it in there. I understand the profile of the athlete. Next place I go in the diagnosis is contribution of power. This is probably the most powerful chart in the system in a way that's misunderstood frequently. And God, I wish I had captured them. I got to click in my cursor before I took the screenshot. But in reality, right, this red line is the power duration curve. But here's what it's telling you. The blue is the watts coming from your anaerobic power. And the green is the watts coming for your aerobic power. You might say, what about ATP system? Well, that's happening right up here. It's still anaerobic. So the reality is this is your anaerobic power and this is your aerobic power. Your power duration curve is this plus this equals this, right? That's so when we start talking about carb burning and fat burning and all this other stuff, you really want to go back to this idea of contribution and output, right? How am I producing that watt? And changes in the green, blue, red relationship tracked over training phases, just using like compare mode and compare them, is a very, very powerful way to see specific adaptations. Very, very powerful. So for me, every 30 days, every month, I tend to cycle out every like I'll create time ranges of every 4 weeks. I'm comparing this month's chart of this to next month's chart of this to next month, or last month's, but I think you get the point. I'm looking at that. So I'll do it in my original diagnosis too. I'll go back, I'll look at what they were for last year, where was peak or race season or whatever. Also, tracking physiological numbers. Here's your physiological dashboard, right? Javier Sola put this together. It's a great dashboard. Definitely found its way into my top 3 to 5. We just have all your numbers, including the new VLA max, glycotic cap. If it depends who you're working with, sprinters, all the steels, but you can use this and again use compare mode to measure. Remember, I can apply power zones, right? That's stress, it's linear. I can do that. Sorry, I went too far. I can track linear stress and training stress score and this and that. I can track direct response in power. But if I want to know, right, that tells me how much horsepower the engine's putting out. That's what that's telling me. But here, these metrics are telling me about tuning the engine. Did the little tune I did that little bigger carburetor, did that little new piston thingy that I put in work better? Therefore, it leads to the end result of we put out more horsepower. That's really the relationship between physiological metrics and power metrics that you want. You have a horsepower, I can measure it. I'm going to diagnose, because horsepower is what drives me down the road. I have to overcome some resistance, right? But it's a power, it's a watt, right? That's pushing me down the road. The engine that's making that, I need to understand it a little better so I can tweak it here and there to put out more power. And I also need to understand it that if the training I'm doing is negatively impacting the engine, right? It I quickly react and fix that. So I keep on track for producing more power. And the other thing to remember here, I stated it, and I probably could have carried it here for you, particularly on this slide. Remember what I said about training load is neutral, right? And physiologically, we begin to change very quickly once we hit a certain minimum training load. But eventually we stagnate. And training, these physiological metrics, these measurements of our physiological systems, they stagnate, they just go flat. And if you keep training, they're going to stay flat. And you could keep training for 6 months and they'll generally stay flat. But your power metrics, right? This chart here, that's going to start going down. So when you think about another performance metric and way to blend it, I'm using a version of, I should have killed that slide, a version of this to look at extended saturation, which Coggin called the plateau, which is probably a better word, meaning it's too flat. Too flat. If I'm not like here, training season, right? Rest season, who knows, testing. This is probably not a good data set, but you see change happening. If it's flat, if it gets up to those kind of peak points in sitting, it's a precursor for decline in performance, isn't it? Think about that. It's one of the ways as we learn to understand physiological, it all comes out in power. It comes out in the power wash, right? And power is the greatest predictor of performance, but this could be a precursor understanding to drop-offs in power due to training stagnation. Physiological, I'm also always tracking. I talked about this here. I'm actually comparing 2 time ranges. I guess I could have left this over here for you, but you can see the curve of last 90 days against all of 2020. So, which probably wasn't a great training year for anybody, but you can see there's a difference, and I can see where there's a difference, bigger difference. I can see difference in FTPs. These charts, because I use big numbers because I have old eyes, I have to scroll down to see the comparative. But the reality is I'm also comparing, and I'm just looking at these elements over time. So let's talk about some examples and open up Q&A of how to make these two work together. I'm just going to try to give you some acute examples, like short term, like right now, what does it matter? I've used this one since the first WKO presentation. So I put it in here as kind of a memory because I still use it. I don't know, I'm old school. CTL top 10. So what this is measuring, this athlete's average CTL over the last 3 years is 110. Their top 10 performances, their top 10 MFTP performances, right, happen at around 105. So I've got a pretty good predictable range for this athlete. There's some colors in here that I have a feeling, since it's blue and green, you can't see. So I can see when these peaks happen. What it's doing, it's simply crossing power and CTL, or threshold and CTL. And I can see, so I know this athlete has a pattern. If they're trained to their kind of known peak, they won't actually hit their best power performance. They got to drop off that a little bit, a little recovery. Most athletes are a little bigger drop off. And the same, this athlete tends to have peak FTP days when their TSB is right around zero, so right around neutral. And this is a way we're using power data, right? We're using power data to drive these metrics. We're using a stress score, training stress per day. So we're using a linear event to predict a non-linear experience. The non-linear prediction is I need to get this athlete into a linear a stress level of 105 to produce heat. Here's another one. This is hard to see, and this is a weird data set. I should have cleaned this data set. You see here a mean max power curve, right? This is P max. So this athlete has a 1900 P max. And here's their VLA max, 1.08. But that's because this data is tainted. It's bad. But I wanted something that showed a really good example, but this might have been too good of an example. But what this green line is showing is how quickly the athlete drops off over time. This is just 1 minute. So this is a sprint. This is finishing sprint. This is, you know, how this is your anaerobic battery, right? Lots of ways to look at it. But you see this athlete dropping off. But then actually, once they drop off, they don't, they drop off the most in the first 8 seconds. And there's probably some bad data in there, but they're pretty flat rate of drop off. This is a resilience. I mean, this athlete has a deep anaerobic. So we learn a lot. Now, I'm going to give you a tip, right? Like, so VLA max is a hot topic, and we actually did a pretty good modeling of it. Works pretty well, and I suggest people use it, and it should be part of your thinking. This is a performance metric based on mean maximal power. This is more important than this. This is a better predictor of how that athlete will perform in those situations than the metric itself, because you're literally looking at how the athlete drops off Pmax, how their sprint fatigue, what they should hold, right? And it's funny, I've been talking with Hamish Ferguson, who's on our beta group here about this a lot. And he's got a cool dashboard, some things he does, which he shared in his Facebook today, which was pretty cool. And we're having a conversation how when you look at this drop off, he does it differently. Just talking about the ideal, he suggests that your Pmax can be too high and actually hurt your sprinting. You won't pick that up. And he's right, in my opinion. Because you can burn through stuff too fast. He's absolutely right. He's smarter at that stuff than me by far. So better voice to listen to. But you wouldn't see that if you weren't measuring the performance data. Another one I use is called cap and cluster. You won't find everything so far is, I think, is in the library. I'm not sure this is, but I just added a little bit to the race readiness and mean max peaks. I have power at VO2 max, MFT, and there's that percentage. So I'm literally looking at that percentage of VO2 max to FTP. So if I look at that athlete sitting here right now, their cardiovascular system, if I look at it over time, is more developed than their metabolic system. I need more metabolic fitness out of this athlete. Raise their threshold. Don't need to worry too much about cardiovascular system. We still have room to grow. They need metabolic fitness. Then this is just a reality of performance clusters of peak performance, and I want to see if they're close or far. And there's lots of reasons to do that. One, to identify anomalies, but two, talk about training resiliency, repeatability, and performance in events. This athlete is clustering top performances around 98%, 98%, 99%. This is a very athlete, not mock, I'm sorry, this is a very resilient athlete. They have a lot of repeat and capability in them in that. So again, think about what we're doing. We're taking power data. We're using models like like FTP and other stuff like VO2 max and modeled FTP, but we're looking at the actual performing data along with it and how they work together. I only have two more slides. Sorry, I'm getting there. Another one, just simply power and DFRC. Yellow's power, look at a workout, right? So drill down a little more acute. Here's a group of intervals. I could immediately see that which ones the athlete went harder, what was their recovery, did they ever drop this below zero? And yes, it can go below zero. And actually, this athlete did. I usually have a line here, but I took the line out of I was testing something, I forgot to put it back in. So zero is right around here. So this athlete dumped it on the second one, right? But man, that was a little too deep, and you can see it in the power. They laid up a little, and then that cost them, right? Look, the power was going. They just couldn't go as deep. They weren't recovering as well. But then they took a little longer break, ratcheted it back up, and then just got the right mental attitude, went deeper. Excellent way to review interval, general interval performance on your anaerobic capacity. But more specifically, here's the same workout. Here's how I would rather review that workout. Um, Time at VO2 max, which is a massive indicator of a predictor of strain, um, gives us deeper insight of strain. So this athlete spent 14 minutes in that same workout over 90% VO2 max, and actually spent 8 minutes at 100%. Peaked it out. Now she was training. I knew what she was doing in here. The data doesn't look good. Weren't doing any long testing because she had no other races except for English hill climbs, which I'm sure a couple of people listening to this webinar know how hard that is, short and hard. She was doing a lot of this stuff going deep. So that gives me excellent insight into the quality of the workout for what we were setting out to do. Again, we're mixing power data. I'm not doing this without looking at her power. I have it here, 339, 322, 322. I can see her power, but I also want to understand that's the horsepower she was putting out. What was the effect on the underlying engine, making them blend together? Okay, I know that was a lot of blinding flashes of the obvious, but that's what I have. I wanted to get this concept video out there and just get people to rejigger their thinking on those two concepts. So I'm going to open it up to any open question related. I really had very few questions, so either I'm a genius explaining things or you fell asleep and are currently drooling on your mouse. Um, it's always hard in kind of concept presentations like this because I know a lot of times people want some highly specific stuff. So while you're thinking of questions, I'm going to give you a couple of tips, and you can certainly, if you don't have questions and want to drop off, go ahead. Um, Kevin and I were just having this discussion back and forth. And we're talking about like some of the tips. What would we give? Well, one of the tips I'm going to start with this one right here in the middle because it happened again today. I got a series of messages on Facebook from an athlete, um, really just over focused on just threshold alone, which is a mistake, and being overly specific. Remember, FTP is just an estimate of a nonlinear function. It's just putting a number to that. And the area around your FTP is a little bit fuzzy. I don't know, 5 watts range around it. It's more of a ball, right? And the reality is, ask yourself what your FTP is set at. If it's not, and if it doesn't end in a 0 and 5, you might be being over precise. It's just not that precise. What I always do in FTP setting, and this was the discussion we were having back and forth, if you test out in one way or another and your FTP, your modeled FTP is 276 watts, I set mine at 280. I always round up to the next 0 or 5. Keep it that simple. It helps me not be overly precise and just understand the system. When you look at another tip, I just jump back to the slide because I was answering this question in a different group today for a while. Too much animation. When you go back to this slide, right? When you think about the plus or the positive or negative influence of strain because we've applied stress, right? You really need to think, and I said this in a lot of other what I'm talking about there is the cost benefit relationship because you don't want a negative response. The negative response to stress occurs when the cost is too high, too much fatigue. I can't train the next day, or that I'm too tired to send the adaptive signal. So if you just think about everything you apply in training, when people ask me all the time, like, how many intervals should I do, or how many, and they ask online, it's like, I can't answer that question because you have to understand the athlete, where they're at in their stress relationship, where they're at in their strain and adaptation relationship, what they can handle right now, because the answer has to be the benefit has to outweigh the cost. So that's definitely something you should always be thinking about in the process. Awesome. Well, thank you everybody for joining today. I'm just going to wrap it up. No questions left. If anybody has them, please feel free to focus. And now I got questions coming in. All right. So one, is power at VO2 max calculated in 4 to 5 minute efforts? No. The VO2 max and power at VO2 max is calculated off the entire power duration curve. So just follow the system of maintaining your curve. If you've done your baseline testing and you're testing the occasional normal, if you're testing the occasional normalized residuals, um, if you test your normalized residuals and you've maintained your model, your VO2 max is not. It was funny, I was having the same discussion with Hamish today. I don't know, I wish he was on here, we can continue it. I don't know, I would say when you start talking about power at VO2 max, 4 to 5 minutes might be a little bit short. And it's more individual to some degree. I might be thinking, just in your general thoughts, 4 to 6 minutes as a whole, and maybe honing down from there. But the model is based on the entire power duration curve. You have to feed it once every 4 to 6 weeks. That is the limitation I put on the slide. What about multi-sport? Same systems apply to multi-sports. I don't think there's anything different. You could look at a lot of this reality in running and stuff like that. Power isn't always available, right? But one of the cool things for multi-sports that I think gets glossed over, you think about this, if you're riding a bike, people say to me, well, I'm only riding in zone 2. I get this from triathlete multi-sport all the time, and just take this as honest feedback. I'm only riding in zone 2, so I don't need to really test or develop my model. Well, two things with that. One, you do need some harder efforts, my opinion. Everybody should have their own. And two, there's a lot of gain for understanding the physiological reality of what's happening underneath the model, because I can apply that to my swim, where power data is really hard to get, and heart rate data and other data is dicey at best. And if I'm not running with power, or even, if I'm just running with pace and other stuff, I mean, if you're running with power, you can utilize it in your running elements. Because remember what I said, the engine, like performance, will once hit a certain training load, they'll both respond rapidly, but then you'll have points of stagnation or plateau, saturation. Um, Understanding, using your bike data to understand that and how it impacts all three sports is really important. But that again, I'm a little more concept. I'm giving ideas into the overall concept. Um, Rider focusing on FTP, marathon mountain bike, should test short, medium, and long protocol. Yes, Victor. Why would you not want to test your full capability, right? Think about what you're saying. You're actually doing literally what I talked about in the first slide. You're just focusing on FTP, right? You want to know your entire capabilities. You want a model that can give you an understanding of VO2 max and MFTP. I explain those pretty deeply, right? One is a relationship of your cardiovascular fitness. One is a relation of your metabolic fitness. If you're training right, they'll both go up. And if you're training really right, they'll coordinate and go up to some peak number at the same time, in which case you'll crush it and win your marathon mountain bike. To get that, you need to maintain the model. There are 2 webinars about maintaining the model. There's actually on the WKO5 help site a section called Coaching and Training with WKO5 that shows you how to run the testing protocols. You need to know if the engine is responding. Power is the predictor. Power is another tell, but you do need to know if that engine's responding because it's going to give you the insight to continue to tune the engine. How does the fatigue built up by running and swimming affect the PD curve? Ted, I would always look at them separately. It's a great question. I wouldn't call it just fatigue. Um, it's hard. Well, I don't fully understand your question, to be honest with you. I do think so. I'm going to make my assumption. You're more fatigued doing some, so you're running and you're swimming, you have different type of fatigue. Running introduces some lower efficiency sport, a little bit more micro trauma, more impact, and whatever might increase fatigue more. So is targeting by all of those and the resulting metrics affected? No. Here's my point, right? As long as you've tested in a reasonably fresh format, the metabolic reality happening underneath is still the same. You're talking about execution, like fatigue is a variable, right? Just like heat might be extreme heat or cold or altitude are variables. Just because those variables stop you from achieving some performance doesn't mean um, you can't do them. What it does do is change the stress and strain relationship, right? Less stress, less power, less TSS might actually result in more strain under those variables. And if I went a little deeper on strain, there is, when you think about the stress strain relationship, there is a point of inflection where a certain amount of fatigue, whether you talk about it acutely in a workout, so talk about it as a workout when you're talking about the stress, actually, it's a good way to think about it. The stress is linear, right? So if I did 200 watts, I could just draw a straight line with 200 watts. But the strain is non-linear. So maybe the strain line is the same for about the first 90 minutes, 2 hours, but at some point there's a point of inflection in strain, and that strain starts going up at a fast rate. It arches up, little hockey stick, not really that aggressive, but a little hockey stick. And an excellent way to think about that is cardiac drift, measurement of that strain. That's what's one indicator that the system is going under more strain due to fatigue. The strain at the beginning of a workout is not the same as a whole at the end. Now, if you apply that to a training cycle and overall load in multi-sport, there's the same reality of that in the big picture. But by understanding and testing accurately and understanding changes in the metabolics, the engine, right? That gives insight into, should the power have been hot? Was it just fatigue in that power? What are those impacts? It does give us insight into that change. Good question. Can you comment on Sealer's position that stress strain is nonlinear? I don't think he would say stress is nonlinear, Gary. I think it's pretty much known from a physiological, any physiologist would know that stress is linear. As a matter of fact, the rest of your statement, what I just explained about cardiac drift, like idea of sprain, I actually had a slide on it in my extra slides. I deleted it just in case somebody asked me the question. But imagine a line going across the a chart, right? And it's stress, and 200 watts is our stress. Watts is external. That's a line, 200 watts. It's one flat straight line. But now if I tried to put a measurement to strain, or I was going under, the strain line would be flat, just like that watts line, assuming that wasn't like 200 watts wasn't super hard for you. It would be flat for a certain amount of time, but then it would start drifting up. That's the increase in strain over time. And that's your point. Third hour costs more than the first and second. And that's absolutely true. And it's important to measure and utilize that relationship. And that's why when you see systems that tell you after a little bit of fatigue, go home, or after the third interval drops off this amount of watts, you should go home. That strain after a certain amount of fatigue can be highly impactful strain. It can be negative. We'll go back to my positive and negative point too. It can be a negative. It depends on your overall fatigue point and training cycle, what you're doing tomorrow. right? If you improve the strain by going longer and harder, and you go through more of that deeper, harder strain at the end of a workout, and that stops you from getting in tomorrow's workout, was it worth it? Was the cost benefit and balance? So I think you're just mixing up terms. I think Dr. Seller and I would agree because I'm not saying anything that isn't physiological fact. What is the best way for prescription of eye levels? Um, I would just use them. Uh, Basically, get your model up and running, and I would prescribe eye levels. Now, it's funny. I can understand where the question is coming from somewhere, because in I do all my general prescription in eye levels. I have a unique. I keep going by it, don't I? Somebody's like, stop that guy, he's killing me. Um, you can use general prescription in eye levels. So I don't use classic levels at all. I use eye levels in all general training. When it comes to a certain point in the season where where we're really now talking about peak performance, um, I use optimized intervals with some twists. I'm working on some improvements to optimized intervals with some beta team members, both for riding and for cycling and running. Um, we there's some things coming. I think so. I do use optimized intervals. I kind of use the power duration curve itself, which I did a video. There's a webinar that I have out there as eye levels, um, about targeting and utilization of eye levels. It's probably intervals. It's building better intervals or something like that. If you watch that, I talk about how to use eye levels, generally eye levels and intervals, and optimized intervals, and how to use the power duration curve as um, exercise itself. So one of the questions that I received in a different format, is talking about, going back to the point I was making. This came early and I deleted it. About LT2, does eye levels and things like that pick up LT1? I think having the ability to model LT1 could be a very powerful addition. Um, and I can tell you it is a future upgrade we're working on. LT1 and understanding whether you're doing polarized training as a method or where LT1 fits within your zone 2 and classic training zones and this and that, I think a lot of people would learn from it. So one of the goals I have on my horizon, which I guarantee Kevin, who I know is on this webinar, is like, son of a bitch, is to get to LT1 calculation. We are doing some work. We're actually running some, not me, some smarter people than me in this one again. There's a lot of that in the world, but LT1 determinations and stuff like that, which I actually think can help us even improve eye levels more. Because right now, uh, endurance, even at eye level, tends to be lumped together a little too broadly. And I think we'll have the ability to target within that. So answer to your question is I basically use the eye levels the same as I would use classic and prescription. When I'm doing intervals in the winter or base training period, whatever you want to call that for you, I stick with eye levels. I don't overthink it because I'm not looking for over precision. When we get into the, wow, now it's time to go and get ready for peak performance, I will use optimized interval targeting of the process. Um, Excellent. Cool. I think I asked all the questions. Thanks for your patience tonight. Sorry if you had confusion joining. I have a feeling I'm going to go face a bunch of complaints. I know something went wrong with the webinar setup. But thanks for being on, and I appreciate the time tonight. Good night, everyone.